Hello. Once again, welcome to our daily reflection, which today begins with a reading from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 24 to 29. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, in his Gospel, Matthew records no less than 5 separate blocks of teaching from Jesus. And in today's reading, he gives us the words that Jesus used right at the end of the first of these teachings, the so-called Sermon on the Mount. Many preachers of the word, and myself included, will tell you that very often achieving a satisfactory ending to a sermon is often the most difficult part of the whole procedure. Can you round it off properly and not leave everybody wondering quite what you've meant by it all? Can you make it sufficiently challenging and still make it easy to understand? Well, Jesus, of course, never had this problem. Matthew tells us that he taught not as the scribes, the usual teachers of the law, did, but as someone who had absolute authority. The scribes could only assume a form of derived authority, as in, Rabbi X said such and such, and on that basis I say this further word. But by confronting people with the presence of God actually in himself, Jesus needed to cite no precedent, and his words conveyed an unmediated reality beyond which there was no appeal. But in addition to that, he also had the ability to illustrate his teaching with these vivid verbal pictures, these parables. And by closing his Sermon on the Mount with the parable of the wise and foolish builders, Jesus left his listeners with a challenging but nonetheless easy to comprehend message. The fact that they would be judged on whether they had heard his words and then acted on them, or had simply let their ears enjoy the sound of his words, but then left them as a memory without doing anything about them. Doing what Jesus says or not doing it. This, he says, it's what makes the difference between a house that stays standing on a storm and a house that falls with a great crash. It is a very vivid picture, isn't it? A very vivid analogy for those who hear it today. But it's one that those who first heard it would perhaps have found even more vivid, because it related to something that was actually happening in their own time. They would have known that in Jerusalem, not too far away from Jesus preached on that day, Herod's men were hard at work rebuilding the temple. They spoke of it as God's house and declared that because it was built upon a rock, it was secure from wind and weather and would therefore stand forever. But later in his 5th and last great sermon, that in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus correctly predicted that even the temple itself would come crashing down because Israel as a whole had failed to respond to his message. Halfway through the gospel, in another dramatic moment, Jesus promises that Peter's confession of faith will form the rock on which something very different will be built: the church, the community that believes in Jesus as Messiah. And so, as I leave you, let me just pose those same questions that Jesus did then and still, of course, does today. In our own lives and in our churches, what sort of houses are we building? Are they built on firm foundations, or are they in danger of being swept away when difficulties arise? Are we actually doing the words of Jesus, or are we just reading them, hearing them, and thinking how fine they are? Amen.